Thank you very much for joining us. The United Nations says what is happening in Afghanistan is a grave crisis for women's rights and a wake-up call for the international community. It's raised the alarm about the Taliban's orders banning women from aid groups and girls from higher education. The UN's highest-ranking female official has just wrapped up a 4-day visit to Afghanistan. We'll be speaking to Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed shortly. But first, this report from Laura Khan.
This was the first high-level meeting between the UN and the Taliban since they retook power in Afghanistan. And the UN delegation by the organisation's highest-ranking woman, Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed. She held talks with Acting Foreign Affairs Minister Amir Khan Muttaqi. Top of the agenda, reversing restrictions on women's access to education and work. A ministry spokesman posted on Twitter that they also discussed travel restrictions on government officials and financial sanctions imposed by the international community. When the Taliban took power in August 2021, Washington froze almost $10 billion in assets belonging to the Afghan central bank. The economy shrunk by at least 20%. The UN says 9 of 10 households don't have enough to eat. NGOs struggled to help after the Taliban banned women working with charities. That ban has now been partially lifted, and UN delegates say they are pleased with the progress. Last month, women were banned from attending university. They've also been banned from attending secondary education and some government jobs. The UN delegation will be looking for progress on this issue too. Laura Khan, Al Jazeera.
Well, joining us now on the News Hour is Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. She led the high-level delegation that met Taliban authorities in Afghanistan this week. Thank you so much, Deputy Secretary General, for being with us on Al Jazeera. What were you able to achieve on this mission? Was it a successful one?
I think we set out in the beginning to make sure we were going to engage with the Taliban over these very grave issues. We also wanted to make sure that it was clear we were there in solidarity with the women of Afghanistan, and we wanted to create the momentum for that pathway to the Afghanistan that can join the international community. So those 3 issues I think we did. I think we did them pretty well, but this is not just one step. It's several steps in a journey back to reality.
Right. Specifically, has there been any progress made on the issue of women working for NGOs and Afghan women and girls being able to attend secondary school?
Yes, there has been some progress. Some exemptions have been made to the edicts that have covered the health sector. And I think that's because the international community, and particularly the partners who are funding this, were able to show the implications and the impact of your woman-to-woman services, particularly childbirth, getting food across in very harsh winter conditions. Not enough. That's just the very beginning. We've opened up a crack, and we hope that through the reversals, we can eventually get to a stage where you neutralise those edicts and women are back in school, and girls, and of course, in the workplace.
Who did you meet within the Taliban leadership, and do they understand the gravity of the rules they've put in place?
We met everyone that was in, first of all, the cabinet. We met ministers there. We met the foreign minister. We met the deputy prime minister. We met the minister that was in charge of refugees and returnees. We went to Kandahar.
Did you meet the supreme leader?
No, we did not meet the supreme leader. That, I think, is a pretty closed door to most. But we did meet the deputy governor in Kandahar and the Shura, the council that take these decisions and that interpret them. And that is very important because, as you know, Islam, its school of thoughts, right now what we're seeing is an aberration on education and workplace for women's rights. That's not what Islam preaches. And so it was very important to go in there and try to have a conversation with them. And they did listen.
Did you get a sense that within this Taliban leadership there is unity or division, perhaps, when it comes to these rules they've implemented?
When you meet the Taliban, there's a lot of hospitality. Everyone is welcoming you. At the same time, if you push enough buttons, you begin to see the ideology come through. What we did see was an understanding of all of them, how important it was for girls' rights and women's rights in education. They all didn't have they didn't push back on that. What they said was that, okay, this is work in progress, and they're going to come back to us with a new framing around which they would protect women that would be accessing education and also the workplace. So I think that they understand. I was surprised that we saw from them a need and a want to be recognized,
right.
and that the humanitarian services were important. So I think you've got fractions. I think you've got the ones that are forward-leaning, and you've got the ones that are holding on to the 13th century ideology.
Yeah, and I will ask you a bit more about this need to be recognized that they have formulated. I wanted to find out more, though, about your meetings with them as a woman, a Muslim woman. You were meeting with the Taliban along with the head of UN Women, Sima Bohous. Did you find that that made a difference, having women in there to have that perhaps uncomfortable conversation for them about women's rights and issues?
It was always very clear to me I'm going in there as an opportunity to air the voices of women of Afghanistan. We heard this from young women who said to us, we don't need your voice, we need you to amplify ours when you get in there, since we don't have that opportunity. So going in there, I was very focused on getting those messages across. Getting into the room, it is always intimidating when you're facing people who do such things in this world as we don't accept. But I think, focus on the issue and push it, and we did. And they didn't, in some cases, didn't accept it and try to put you in your place. But I think we were strong enough to push back.
The reason I ask this is because very often there's been criticism that all too often foreign delegations send men-only teams which reinforce the Taliban's conservative views of the world. Was the decision to send you, a Muslim woman, to lead this delegation on the basis of representation or likelihood of progress?
No, I think you find yourself a Muslim woman at the helm of affairs in the United Nations, and it so happens that there's a delegation of work that you do in that, and the top diplomat goes out there. Being a Muslim woman, I think, was a plus for the international community, because I know that my religion doesn't teach or preach that we don't have a right to education. I'm a product of education. I'm the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. So that in itself, I think, was important. It was never guaranteed we were going to get these meetings with the Taliban. And in one instance, they reminded me that, it was haram for me to be even sitting in the room with them when I pushed too hard. That, for me, was progress. Because haram or not, I was sitting there and I was delivering messages.
Right. Now, the Taliban leaders, as you've alluded to, have said that conditions compliant with their interpretation of Islamic Sharia law and Afghanistan's conservative traditions must first be in place before they consider reversing some of these rules and some of these bans. What is your sense, after meeting them, of why they're banning women from attending school or working? Is it all about religion, or is it perhaps also about using women and girls as a bargaining chip with the international community?
It's not either or, it's both. I mean, they've realized that this is a lever that they have with the international community. It matters to us. And at the same time, there is an ideology there. It is a conservative society beyond the Taliban, and the Taliban use that. And I think that when we sat there to discuss the tenets of Islam, not in any great depth, but just, Iqra, the first word in the Quran, we're talking about knowledge, seeking light. They will tell you, I will tell them that I'm also a Sunni. They may be Hanafi, I'm Maliki, but I don't see anywhere that says, we don't have a right to education. So I think that, the conversations were helpful in that we were trying to hold the ground that it was not acceptable. I had a number of consultations going in, and there is a consensus in the Muslim world, of course in the international community, that women's rights and girls' rights and the right to work, the right to be part of an economy, are not for negotiation.
Right. Now, one of their arguments has been that the absence of international recognition, as you've said, along with the sanctions, is hindering their ability to govern effectively, to govern Afghanistan effectively. But it would also seem, when you look at what's been happening in the last year and a half, that perhaps they don't really care about that international recognition, do they? I mean, the only thing the international community engages on is humanitarian help. And if clearly today the international community was to stop the humanitarian help to Afghanistan, it wouldn't just be the Taliban, but the Afghan people who would be punished. So I wanted to know if the humanitarian lever was the only one that could be used in this instance, or are there other incentives, perhaps, that could be offered to Afghanistan? and the Taliban?
The engagement with them this time, I was surprised how important recognition was to them. I thought that didn't matter. I'm pretty sure there's 3, 4 of the Taliban who would be happy to have the door closed and stay in their isolation. But there is the lever of recognition. There is the lever for the humanitarian aid. They constantly told us that they had made progress, that they were less corrupt. In fact, they tell you that they have eliminated corruption. They are safer. And they would tell you that they're collecting taxes and that there is no recognition of that in the progress towards the conditions. What I'm telling them is that you might be, in the case of some edicts, I'll give you credit, you've brought back some edicts for women, but then you're giving with one rights and you're taking away with the other. That's not acceptable. We want all of them because they're just fundamental. So I think an engagement is important. We have to push and pull on this until we get to a place.
Do you think we're at a point, though, where, because of what's happening to these women and girls in Afghanistan today, that the international community should perhaps reconsider its stance on recognition, and even the United Nations? Would the UN recognize the Taliban eventually?
I hope there's a day that we do recognize this government, provided it is based on the principles that they need to understand they have to uphold as part of the international family. But I do fear that what we are doing is having women and girls caught in the crossfire. And it's really important we don't do that. We heard the stories of many Afghan women who, because of this, are not able to feed their children. They're painful stories of women don't know where the next meal is coming from. There's a level of depression I think no one has ever imagined in Afghanistan. What is abhorrent to Islam is suicide, and yet we're hearing the rise of that amongst women. We just know, and I know, that we can't abandon the women of Afghanistan. We lost a parliamentarian, Mosal, just recently. That's not acceptable. They may have this ban that they say there are no reparations, responses to killings or revenge. But there are disappearances. Right. There are women who are living in fear every day.
And so how has the ban on women working for NGOs, for example, affected the UN's work in Afghanistan and the humanitarian response there? And are you concerned that, with some of your, the organizations that you work with, some of the NGOs that you work with on the ground not operating right now in Afghanistan, that the situation could actually even get worse as winter sets in?
Absolutely. I mean, these are horrendous situations you see people living and dealing with, and they will die if it continues like this. This is women-to-women services. 28 million Afghans depend on humanitarian aid, and it's essential that they get it. And, right now, this is affecting the lives of women. It's affecting the lives of Afghan people. So
then should these NGOs resume their operations, perhaps, given the gravity of the situation?
They have in some cases, because there have been exceptions. What we're saying is that as much as possible, open up the exceptions until such time as we push the timeline until further notice with the Taliban. It's really important that that happens. But we do have to stay and deliver. And there are committed people on the ground doing that. Afghan women, international staff, they're all there and they're willing to do that. What we do have is a plea to the generosity of institutions like the European Commission, like USAID, not to give up on Afghan women and girls. At the same time, there must be the political leverage and conversation that pushes the Taliban themselves to recognize these rights and to move their country to a place where, women can be safe, they can participate. They are half of the country's population. And as I will always say, no bird flies on half a wing.
All right. The final question, Amina Mohammed. There are many Afghans, especially many women and girls, who feel that much of the world has forgotten about the country they once invested so much commitment and cash into, and who also feel that they're being instrumentalized for political ends, especially the women and girls, that they're being instrumentalized for political ends by all parties, whether it's Western countries, the donors, or even the Taliban. What do you say to the Afghan women and girls who are watching us today? What is your message to them?
Well, they were clear to me, take our voices out there and amplify them, and we're doing that, and I intend to do that, and committed to finding those pathways for engagement. There may be unintended consequences of the political dialogue that women bear the brunt of this. And I think that we have to remember that in itself is the reason why we need to get past these political impasses that we have because, as they say, the elephants are fighting, the grass is getting trodden. The women are getting trodden on. They need to breathe, they need to come back, they need to have their rights protected and given back to them where they've been taken away. It is incredibly important. We went there to engage, to stand in solidarity and to find a way forward. And I'm confident that we can do that together. But the international community, the region, the people in Afghanistan all need to be united in pushing forward on that so that we can bring the Taliban back to the table and in the position that they should be to be part of this family.
Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.